am Mostly Kissing, an associate editor at IDP Academic. And I'm here today to share with you an interview that I recently did with Dr. Carmen Imes, the author of Bearing God's Name. We're sad that we can't gather with you in person at ETS, but Bearing God's Name is one of the books that we really want you to hear more about, and so that you can buy your own copy and take advantage of your ETS discount. In this interview, Carmen and I talk about the ideas in Bearing God's Name and how it's been received and what are some of the things that she's heard from readers along the way. Enjoy.
First, Carmen, what made you want to write this book and who did you write it for?
Well, I have always loved the Old Testament. Even as a small child, I loved it. It is a rich source for theological reflection and ethics, but many Christians don't know what to do with it. So there are so many passages that seem mysterious to us or objectionable, violent, or even just strange. We don't know what to do with them. And so I wrote this book to try to help Christians reconnect with the Old Testament, to help them see how it is their story and how they can begin to connect with it and draw inspiration for their Christian life from it. I did my PhD at Wheaton College under Dr. Daniel Block, and the focus of my study there was the command not to take the Lord's name in vain as part of the 10 Commandments. And I published that research in this volume, Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, which is published by Penn State University Press. But all the way through this study, I kept thinking these are concepts and truths that the church needs to hear, but the church is not going to read this book. It's a very, very technical volume, interacting with ancient languages and technical ideas, using lots of big words. So I wanted to represent the results of my research for the church. So when you ask who did I write it for, somebody advised that, maybe it was you, Anna, it's possible that you're the one who told me to choose a person that you want to write the book for. So my person, when I was writing Bearing God's Name, was a guy named Earl. Earl is a member of the church we attended at the time in Oregon City, Oregon. And Earl he is a retired high school shop teacher. He came to my Sunday school class every week. I taught an adult Sunday school class where we went through various books of the Bible, and he just seemed like a really eager Christian. Like he wanted to know the scriptures and he wanted to know why they mattered and how they mattered. But Earl was not going to pick up a book. He confided in me one time that he had never read a book cover to cover except for once. In high school, he read a welding manual from cover to cover. That was the only book he read completely. And I thought to myself, if I could write a book that Earl would read, then it would be a win. So just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got a text message from Earl. He bought the book back in December, right after it came out. And he texted me just a few weeks ago to say, Dr. Imes, I just wanted to let you know I finally finished your book. You made it come alive for me. And I loved the illustrations you used. I loved how you put yourself into the book. And then he pulled out a particular illustration I had used about a construction site. And he just thought that was a great story. So he wanted to thank me for the book and say that he loved it. And I was like, yes, Earl read the book.
Wow, that is success. That
Yeah.
is a beautiful story. And I think it really does speak to the level of the book. It's for you want the book to be accessible for anybody who wants to open it and understand more about Sinai, about the Old Testament.
Yes. In fact, I had our daughter helped me edit the book before I sent it to you to be edited. She read the entire thing, and we took out, she was 17 at the time, we took out every word that she didn't know, with one exception. She didn't think the word conduit was a word that people would know. And I said, oh, but Earl knows that word, so we're keeping it in.
Well, there is quite a bit of confusion about what role the Old Testament and especially the law plays in the life of Christians. And it's not just people in the pew. We have lots of different opinions from Christian leaders and pastors. And I'd love to hear from you. Why do you think there's so much confusion about this? And why do you think some people think of the law as something that we set aside? I know that's not what you think. And the subtitle of your book is Why Sinai Still Matters. So help us understand kind of some of what's going on with this topic.
Yeah, I think Christians know implicitly that something has changed after Jesus, that our relationship with the Old Testament is not quite the same as it was for Jews in the first century before Jesus died and rose again. But because we've mischaracterized the law in the first place, our understanding of what's happening at Sinai is skewed. So then we think what Jesus came to do is to fix the problem that is the law, rather than to transform our hearts. And so I think our misdiagnosis of the Old Testament is one big factor. And then I think there are some statements in the New Testament that seem at first glance to be tossing aside the Old Testament law. Paul has some harsh things to say about the law. The book of Hebrews has some things to say about the law as well that maybe at first glance would and maybe it's not fair to say at first glance. There are reputable scholars who are studying these passages and studying Paul's approach to the law and the book of Hebrews' approach to the law, and they're concluding negative things about Sinai. But I think part of that stems from misunderstanding what's happening at Sinai in the first place. So one of the big ideas that I try to get across in the book, and the reason I think that Sinai still matters, is because I don't see the law as Israel's means of salvation. This is not how the Israelites got saved. God already rescued them from Egypt before he gives them the law. They are not agreeing to abide by the law so that he will save them. He saves them first, and the law comes after that. And the law is their means of demonstrating to a watching world what God's character is like. He's forming them into a new kind of community for the sake of mission. So the law is not a means of salvation, but the means of establishing God's mission through the people of Israel. And so it's the place where they find out their identity and their vocation. And this is why I think it still matters, because when Jesus comes in Matthew 5, he says that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And he said that it wouldn't pass away until all things, the purpose of all things had come to fruition. And when I look around at the world, I can see that the world is still a very broken place, and that God's great promises about making all things new have not fully happened yet. He accomplished a lot in Jesus, but we're still in that in-between time. And so I think we need to go back to Sinai to rediscover our purpose and our identity as Christians. What does it mean for us to represent God in the world?
Okay, the title, Bearing God's Name, comes from your translation of the name command from the Ten Commandments. So talk to us about that commandment, how we've misread it, and what you think it really means.
Yes. So the command in the King James reads, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." And most interpreters through history have assumed that taking God's name in vain has something to do with swearing or pronouncing his name in a certain way or in a certain context. And I argue in my dissertation, and I argue in this book, that the command is actually much broader than that it's not limited to speech. If we look at the Hebrew, it reads, "You shall not bear or carry the name of Yahweh your God in vain." And I think what's happening is that at Sinai, Yahweh is claiming the Israelites to be his own special people. And he's doing that by this act of verbal branding. He puts his name on them to claim them as his own. And then they are to go out and represent him among the nations. So the command is not saying, it's not limited to their oath taking. It's not just saying don't take false oaths or don't use my name flippantly. It's much larger than that. It's saying you are my people. So now go out and live as though you're my people. Don't misrepresent me among the nations. That's the heart of my dissertation, and I look at it from lots of different angles. I look at metaphor theory, and I look at the historical context, and I look at the literary context. And probably the most persuasive thing I found as I was working on my dissertation was this scene where God gives Moses the instructions for how to make the high priestly garments. And he tells Moses to make Aaron's garments with a breast piece with 12 gemstones. Each gemstone is inscribed with one of the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then we're told, and so Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel before Yahweh. And so it's the same phrase, bear the names, that we get in the command, do not bear the name of Yahweh your God in vain. And those two are just a few chapters apart. And the more I looked at it, the more I saw connections between them. The high priest is a visual model of what the entire nation is supposed to be. They are a kingdom of priests. God tells them that in Exodus 19. So then for them to be a kingdom of priests, they would be watching the high priest to find out how they're supposed to behave in relation to the nations. And the high priest, in fact, has Yahweh's name written right on his forehead on this gold medallion. It says, "Holy belonging to Yahweh," on his forehead. And so and then that same phrase is used to describe the whole nation of Israel as a people wholly belonging to Yahweh. That's in the book of Deuteronomy. So when we put all these pieces together, it tells me that God has a mission for his people that he's giving them at Sinai to be his representatives. So it's like they're all branded or wear this invisible tattoo with God's name. And they're supposed to go out and live well. And that's what the rest of the laws flesh out, what that would look like, to bear God's name well among the nations.
So once the people of Israel are called to bear God's name, to represent him throughout the world, then how do we see that play out through the rest of Scripture after they leave Sinai and then on into the New Testament? How does this change or stay the same?
Yeah, it's a great question. Once you've seen this theme of bearing God's name, you can't unsee it. You'll see it all through the Bible. I have students writing me every year who have left Prairie, and they had me for their Old Testament classes, and then they're off in their churches somewhere going through a sermon series on whatever book of the Bible, and they come across a phrase and they email me to say, "Is this about bearing the name?" And I get excited that they're still thinking about it. I have found this theme in almost every book of the Bible. It's really amazing how pervasive it is, and we just haven't talked about it because we haven't seen it. Once you see it, it's everywhere. So here's an example, Psalm 23. That's a pretty familiar text to most of us. It says, "He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake." Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, why would my guidance on right paths have anything to do with his name? Well, if I'm bearing his name, then my life walking in a right path serves as an advertisement for God. It's his reputation is attached to me. So the way I live matters because it reflects back on him. And you see that all through the Psalms, lots of places where it talks about his namesake. Throughout the prophets are chastising the people because they have failed to bear the name well. Ezekiel 36 says that when the people went into exile, they profaned God's name because then it was said among the nations, these are Yahweh's people, and yet they had to go out of his land. And so God decides to bring them back to Israel, bring back the Israelites to the land of Israel and to restore them, not because they're behaving better now, but because his name has been so profaned, they're so besmirched or so disregarded by the nations that he needs to do something about it. So he cleanses them and brings them back and reestablishes in the land for his sake, for his name's sake. And then when we get to the New Testament, we see Jesus, when he teaches his disciples to pray, he's asking them to pray, "Hallowed be thy name." And I used to think that this was just Jesus like complimenting God or something, like he's somehow saying, "Wow, God, you're really holy." But it's actually, "May your name be holy." And if you think about it in light of this command, if the people of God bear his name and his reputation is attached to them, then the only way to sanctify God's name is for God's people to live rightly, for them to live faithfully to the covenant. So when Jesus prays, "Hallowed be your name," he is committing himself to covenant faithfulness. He's asking God to empower him to live like he's supposed to as a covenant member. So Jesus talks about it. Then Paul talks about it. When Paul is converted to the worship of Jesus on the road to Damascus, let me just pull up this passage so that I quote it properly. God talks to Ananias and tells him to go pray for Paul and restore his sight. And he says to Ananias in Acts chapter 9, verse 15, the Lord said to Ananias, "Go, this man is my chosen instrument to," and it says in the NIV, to proclaim my name, but it's actually to bear my name to the Gentiles, before Gentiles and kings, and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. So Paul's being selected as God's representative. He's being selected to bear God's name before Gentiles. He's going to take the news out to the next level of people and invite them in. And then when you go all the way to the book of Revelation, John sees in his vision what's been invisible all the way along. He sees the 144,000 gathered, and they have the Father's name. They have Jesus' name and the Father's name written on their foreheads. So it's like this invisible brand becomes visible, like it comes under the black light and the invisible ink is visible, or something. And in fact, there's a corollary to that. Those who are not showing allegiance to Yahweh have the mark of the beast on them. They're showing allegiance to the beast. So this idea of bearing God's name goes from being a metaphor to being a vision for John. And he actually sees every person bears a name, either the name of God or the name of those standing up in opposition to God.
So you've said sort of like branding, allegiance, representing, sharing. Are there other ways that you would, other verbs or other ways that you might talk about bearing God's name, especially when it comes to us today, when we think about ourselves as followers of Jesus bearing God's name? What kinds of things might come to mind for that?
Yeah, I think Michael Heiser uses the phrase believing loyalty. I really like that because it puts together the mental things we're believing, but with our actions, the loyalty that we show to him. I like that language. I would say there's just a practical outworking of our faith, and it's not apart from our being saved. It's part and parcel of what it means to be saved, is to join a covenant community which has this mission. In the book, and I think in the videos as well, I talk about the game of blob tag, and I often use blob tag as an illustration because if you've grown up in church circles and you've heard people talk about election, not voting for president, but who has God chosen to be saved? This whole concept of election is often thought of very passively, like God picks us. But I think of the biblical concept of election more like the game of tag, where if I tag you and you're it, you don't just sit back and say, "Oh, wow, Carmen picked me, I'm it. Isn't this great?" Being tagged means that you now have a job to do. Your job is to run around and tag as many people as you can. And so in the game of blob tag, you never stop being it. You just keep tagging other people until everyone's tagged. And so that's why I love the illustration, because when God chooses Israel, it's not so that they can just sit there and feel smug. God's choosing them. And in that choosing, they've been given a new purpose. And that purpose is to represent him to the nations. Now, you asked about like whether there's a shift in the Bible as you go through from Old to New Testament. And there is one shift in this regard. The Israelites are not told to go and tell the news about what Yahweh is like. They stay in one place, and they're supposed to be like a light on a hill, city on a hill. So there's a come and see approach in the Old Testament that transitions in the book of Acts to becoming a go and tell. Jesus begins sending out his disciples, and then there's a full transition in Acts chapter 1 where they begin to go and tell. But in both cases, the obedience of the Israelites and the obedience of the church is integral to the mission of being a light to the nations. And in fact, in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, the passage about being salt and light comes immediately before Jesus' affirmation that he has not come to do away with the law. He's come to fulfill it, and that we need to think about fulfilling it too, because that's our means of being salt and light.
So, as you've heard from so many different people about these ideas, I know that you've been getting some questions that people have in response that either they wish you had talked about or things like that. Why don't you tell us some of the most common questions, one or two of the most common questions that you've gotten and how you responded?
Sure. A lot of people have asked me about the New Testament's take on the law, particularly Paul and the letter to the Hebrews. And I do have a short section in the book that talks about Paul and the law, and another section that talks about Hebrews. And so you can look there to see more. But I would say that people want to know, why does Paul sound so negative about the law? Why it feels like you're disagreeing with him. And I think our problem is that we often think of Paul as responding to our version of the Old Testament law in as though Paul is disagreeing with Moses and the way we've understood Moses. But in fact, Paul is talking to people in his own context who have distorted the law of Moses themselves and are missing the boat. And so Paul is correcting them. He's not trying to throw out the law altogether. And all you need to do is look at Paul's letters. Most of Paul's letters start off with exposition for about half of the book, and then they move into exhortation for the other half of the book. And the exhortation is, here are all the ways this should change your life and change your behavior, and you should live differently. So Paul's not getting rid of any instructions for how to live. He's not saying we're free from the law, we don't have to think about how to live anymore. He's spending a tremendous amount of time telling people how to be faithful followers of Jesus. He's reframing the law for his own context, so he can't possibly be setting it aside. So I think we need to reframe our understanding of what he's addressing. Who is he addressing?
That's fascinating, and I think very thought-provoking for me, and I'm sure for everybody that's watching now.
Yeah.
We are going to wrap up soon, but I want to give you a chance to talk about how this work has inspired you towards other projects or other ideas, or just share a little bit more about where your work is headed these days.
Yes.
How's your work kind of changed, or where are you headed now?
Yeah, I'm working on a full-length commentary on the book of Exodus for Baker Academic. That's been really great because it's forcing me to slow down and look at every verse. And once I get to the laws, I'll probably be ready to write a book about laws. And as you know, I'm writing another book for University Press that will be a prequel to this book, entitled, provisionally entitled, Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. I think that bearing God's name addresses so many important questions about Christian identity and vocation, but there are larger questions to ask about human identity and vocation. And so I'm really excited to be exploring that. I'm focusing in the first part of the book on Genesis 1 to 11 and what we see there about what does it mean to be human and how has God wired people to do his work in the world, and then tracing that theme of being the image of God into the New Testament to see how it is expressed in Jesus and how the book of Revelation shows us where it's all headed. So that's my current project. Excited to be thinking about that, and it will pair really well with this one.
I can't wait. I know that you have lots of eager readers and watchers who can't wait to see this next book when it comes.
Yes,
no rush.
when it comes. This one's taking a little longer for me to write because it's not my dissertation research, so I'm having to read lots of other dissertations to get ready to get me in the right space for it.
Well, we really appreciate you being with us tonight, Carmen. Yeah. Thank you so much for answering questions, for being available. I'm glad to hear from you. I'm sure all of our watchers are very glad to hear more about the course and the book. Thanks so much.